I would argue the Commission has a threefold purpose: rescuing from the losses of the past, it's basically facilitating accurate historical construction in the present, and it's facilitating reconstruction by making material available that otherwise mightn't be accessible to readers.
So we absolutely need the Irish Manuscripts Commission to continue this work. It's so vital that we bring primary sources to people who might not, because of geographical or other reasons, might not be able to get into the archives themselves.
For the very first time, that manuscript map collection for Ireland will actually be available to the wider Irish population. I'm editing a volume at the moment called Mapping Ireland, which is a catalogue of maps that were made in Ireland during the decades of plantation. And these were maps that were produced at the time when England and later Britain were beginning to colonise Ireland. So they're the maps basically that show us what Ireland was like prior to plantation, what actually happened during plantation, and what it looked like at the end of the plantation. So when we look at these maps, we can, for example, identify maps that were military maps, which helped military men at the time during wars and battles in Ireland. It helped them to maybe identify fortifications or design fortifications, but it also helped them to identify routeways across Ireland. Then we also have maps that looked at basically what the provinces were like at the time. So outlining maybe what would have been the lordships of Ireland. So these great Irish chieftains that we hear about, where did they live and how much of the land did they own? We then have maps that show, for example, the preparations for the plantation. So outlines of plantation, as we would call them, seigneuries or estates. And then in Ulster, for example, outlines of baronies and proportions as they were, which became the plantation estates. And then as time went on and settlers came to Ireland, we begin to see maps that show the landscape changing. So we see the new towns, places like Bandon in County Cork, Derry up in Ulster. We begin to see smaller settlements across the landscape, like those that were built by the London livery companies, particularly in what became County Londonderry of the plantation. And then we also begin to see the different settlements and plantation villages that were built in the private estates. So some of those would have been areas like Bangor, for example, in County Down, or indeed Carrickmacross down in County Monaghan. So these are a really interesting set of materials because they tell us an awful lot about what Ireland was like in the 16th and 17th century. If you're interested in geography, for example, you can look at these maps to see the sea coasts of Ireland and how ports evolved, for example, and how the different kind of mountain ranges in Ireland acted as passes around the country or as obstacles within the landscape to development. You can see, for example, within these maps how people worked on the landscape. Quite a number of them, for example, show agricultural products being produced. Some show industrial evolution in Ireland, and others, of course, show very much the architecture of Ireland at the time. So we can look and we can compare and contrast what Ireland was like before the plantation, during the plantation, and even indeed after the plantation when we look at some of the later maps.
One of the more ambitious undertakings of my academic life has been an attempt to try and reconstruct the series of proclamations that were produced on behalf of the Irish administration between the mid-17th century and the early 19th century. The proclamation was an instrument of government which was publicly published and made available to society. It was a means through which the state interacted with and communicated with the population. And they are, in that context, highly illuminating. I mean, it took the best part of a decade to put this collection together. What prompted me to engage with it in the first instance was my utilisation of proclamations in the National Archives of Ireland, where they had a collection which was assembled painstakingly, I think, to try and compensate for the unrivaled collection that they possessed that was destroyed in 1922. And what that demonstrated to me was two things. One was that they were a useful source of information in and of themselves. Allied to this, that they indicated what society thought was important. But thirdly, it was that they also were a critical instrument of government that operated at a level slightly below that of the Act of Parliament, but which was a crucial means by which the state related to the population. There's little about the society in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries in which this engages, in which it doesn't have something useful to say. So I mean, it seems to me that every historian who is engaging with any subject should at least check out the series to see what utility it might be. But then there are surprising usages. And one of the more surprising usages is that its composition coincided with an attempt initiated by in the Dáil to try and regularise and to streamline the Irish Statute Book, because the Irish Statute Book contains a large amount of legislation which is enacted pre-1922, much of which is effectively moribund or is fairly referred to, but as long as it's on the Statute Book, it can have a legal existence. And it was gratifying in that context that the Attorney General's Office, which was engaged in this activity, and which it came to its peak in about 2016, 2017, actually consulted the proclamations, because they were able thereby to get a window on certain pieces of law.
So my edition is based on Crown Files at Assizes, which are essentially witness statements that were taken before the case was heard at the Assize Court. So concealment of birth then criminalises the act of concealing the birth of a child who's subsequently found dead. So it's punishable by up to 2 years in prison with hard labour. So men, women, sometimes even children testified as to what they knew or what they had seen. And one by one, each witness came before the courts, and those witnesses could be policemen, they could be doctors, they were workhouse residents, they were neighbours, relatives, friends of the accused. And the suspect themselves would also be offered the opportunity to make a statement. So these records are located in the National Archives of Ireland, and they're located off-site. And the edition includes records relating to 19 counties from 1883 to 1900. Records relating to modern-day Northern Ireland are housed in Proney in Belfast. But records relating to years outside this period or for the other counties were likely destroyed in the Four Courts fire in 1922. So this source is absolutely amazing. So what it really offers us an insight into lives for ordinary individuals. So as they're given their witness statements, they're describing what they know, describing what they saw, but they're also inadvertently telling us about 19th century life, about society, about the economy, about how the law works. So each of the 115 cases is really a story in itself. So it tells us about individuals, it tells us about the locality. But if we look at all of the cases together, we can really see the realities of Irish society and what life was like for its inhabitants. And I think it's absolutely vital that we preserve these records, that we showcase the records, that we make them accessible to people both in Ireland and abroad. And I have been contacted by individuals who recognised family members in the volume and had never known about the case before. So I think it can really show us our history. It shows us where we have come from, how attitudes have slowly changed, and where we are today.